don't know whether they are planning on. But yeah,
I'll watch for them.
We are live.
We're live. Welcome to the book launch for Dissonance of Birdsong by Alexandra Beaumont. It came out last Tuesday, so it's available everywhere now. So we'll go around the panel and let everybody introduce themselves and plug whatever they have going on if they're interested. So Owen, we'll just start with you.
So hi, I'm Owen Oakwood. I write cozy paranormal fiction set in the contemporary Peak District. This is self-published, so it's all just on Amazon currently. But this is my latest book. It still has the Amazon proof thing, which you can ignore. But this is no feedback. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. No feedback now, which kind of mixes up cryptocurrency and changelings and people accidentally opening gates to hell under Grindleford and all that kind of stuff. But I'm on the panel because I beta read Testament of the Stars and Dissonance of Birdsong a couple of years ago, and obviously was very impressed. So yeah, that's me.
Excellent. Patrick, how about you?
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Patrick Mahon. I write science fiction and fantasy. I'm also a book reviewer, and I briefly worked with Alex a few years ago in the real world of jobs and environmental policy and working for the government. And I'm here because I read Alex's first book when that came out a while back, and really loved it. And so when I heard that there was a second book in the offing, I was really keen to find out what it was, to read it and to review it. So looking forward to having the chat. And
Paul, how about you?
Hi, I'm Paul Martin. I'm a freelance editor, so I develop other people's great ideas and works. I'm mostly a history specialist, but I'm a jack of all trades. And I'm here because for some strange reason, I was twisted into doing an early stage read of both of Alex's books, being her husband, and I love what she does, and I'm here to support it in every way I can.
Excellent. All right, Alex, time to plug yourself away.
Hello, so I'm Alexandra Beaumont. I am a folklore fantasy author, which means I take all the kind of old wives' tales, old sort of mysterious stories about sort of not stepping on the cracks or not going under ladders or not fearing the witch in the wood or fearing the witch in the wood, and turn those into a kind of fantasy fiction. And my latest book is what we're talking about today, which is Dissonance of Birdsong. And that's based on an ancient Cornwall society of people who live on this harsh cliff top. But what they do is they breathe in the mist from these lungs of these birds to survive it. But the mist is running out. So this is a story very much about sort of the contested resources running out, and the main character basically going on an adventure to try and work out where they are, why they're running out, and try and save the day before her sister gets exiled to the mines. It's young adult fantasy with a heavy crossover appeal. And yeah, it's, if you want something that's raw and lyrical and visceral, this is very much a story for you.
Yeah. And hi, Sally, glad you could make it. Oh, I don't think we can hear you. You might be on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Hi. Sorry, I'm late.
No worries. We're just taking a minute to introduce ourselves. So if you've got anything you want to plug or talk about, now's your chance.
Nothing to plug. I just was lucky enough to beta read a first draft of this book, and I absolutely love it. So yeah, really pleased to see it's out, basically.
Us too. And we're Heather and Steve from Bridget's Gate Press. We're the publishers. So we're not nearly as exciting or artistic, but we're along for the ride. So how we usually start these things is I tell the story about my mother, who I almost invited to come today, and now I kind of wish I had. But we grew up, my mother read to us every day when we were young. We got a story before nap time and a story before bedtime. And as we grew older, it was always stories before bedtime, well into my teen years. So there's a famous family story where we took a literary 4-day weekend trip to Estes Park to stay at the Stanley Hotel. And for those of you who don't know, that's where Stephen King wrote The Shining. And we stayed in the Stephen King room, and my mother read the whole entire book out loud to us while we were there. And my sister was perhaps maybe a little too young for The Shining. And so there's a scene that takes place in a bathroom that is so descriptive and so real. And the hotel, other than updating the plumbing, has done nothing to change the bathroom. So my sister had to go to the bathroom at 10 o'clock one night and refused. She went in, turned off the light, shut the door, and refused to use the hotel bathroom for the rest of our stay. So I would have to tromp down to the lobby with her to use the bathroom every time she needed to go. So she's one of those narrators where still to this day at 51, when I read a book, when I know the book is going to be solid and it's one that I'm going to finish, it's her voice that becomes the narrator in my head. And so there's three of us who greenlight a book, but my greenlight always happens when I start to hear my mother read the story instead of myself. And so this one started really early on. Yeah. And I'm going to read the paragraph that really sealed it for me. But the opening line, I snarled in the smoke-laced darkness. I was like, oh, I snarled in the smoke. Okay, I'm listening. But this is when my mother started to read. Waves laced with the cries of birds broke against the peninsula outside, singing to me of freedom. Sneak to the salt water before it's too late. Blood dribbled from my nose, but excitement thrummed, beat through me like a drum. It was time. And that was it. It was really it was time where it transitioned to my mother instead of my voice. And so I knew I was hooked from then on. So that's when I greenlighted the project, even though I kept reading. But so it's one of these stories where I call it the first line grab. And I don't really have an attachment to the word snarl, but something about snarling smoke-laced air, early on, I was like, okay, let's do this. I mean, it really grabs your attention and you like sit up and pay attention because, when you think about snarling air, I have asthma. So I think about, okay, so this is difficult. I'm going to fight for the air. And so I don't know if it's because of my asthma that it grabbed my attention or it's just the language that grabbed my attention, but it really did it from sentence one on. And so, Alex, I want to talk about why what snarling air feels like, if you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you kind of have hit into it there with the asthma thing, really. So while I was writing Dissonance, I had just been diagnosed with chronic sinusitis, and I was really coming to terms with what that actually meant, because physically, in terms of like my body's strength, I felt really strong. I felt like I should be able to do things that, and I know that there's others on the call that also very much relate to this. And I found it very frustrating that I would do these things that I felt like I could do, but then my nose would be bleeding, my throat would be like constricted, and I wouldn't be able to breathe. I'd be dizzy. And I thought, I want to write about like my experience, that I'm sort of coming to terms with what this means for my body. So really the story of Azelde is her coming to terms, her living with this and trying to find ways to overcome it. And what I really didn't want to do was write a story where magic just fixes it, because that's a bit of a rubbish, like,
it's the dream.
Right?
Yeah,
it's the dream, but it's not a very realistic dream. So I wanted Dissonance basically to be like this ongoing like dialogue and struggle with it, and it's always there for her, even when she finds ways to make it work for her a bit better. It's always like a backdrop to her life. And so that was really like a big core of this for me. Yeah.
And you can feel it kind of weaving through the whole story. And I think that's very true of chronic illness, is that even on a really good day, even on several good days, there's a thread of it that's just always present. We always call it the red thread that, because I do a lot of fiber arts, and the red thread is always the one you can't bury. it's always the one that sticks out no matter what other thing you put with it. And it can make it look marvelous or it can help it blend in, but it's always there. And so I feel like chronic illness is the red thread in this story, that even when she's adaptive, and even when it isn't upfront and in your face, you're still very aware of this physical breath struggle. And I think that's a significant piece. And I think it's something that doesn't get explored a lot in fiction. I think chronic illness shows up, but I think there is this kind of dream of, and then a magic thing happens, and it's like a curse that gets lifted and everyone lives happily ever after. And I mean, listen, I think anyone with chronic illness always secretly hopes that happens in their lifetime. But I think the key to it is just being adaptive and being aware that it's something that always has weight, and it's the weight of it, I think, that I really enjoyed about the story, because it's just one of those things where we can go in the mountains and I will fall asleep at the dining table because the air is so thin and I haven't adjusted and I've literally just walked from a hotel room to the restaurant. Like we're not in the mountains hiking, I'm not carrying the luggage. I've just walked maybe 400 feet, and then I'm out. I mean, I'm out cold before a cocktail shows up. Like I'm just sleeping at the table, like I've already been to the bar too long.
It's okay. We love you.
So, but it's one of those things that I think that if you have a chronic illness or someone in your life who has a chronic illness, I think it's a great journey piece, because it's very realistic, and it's got a lot of gut to it, without kind of shoving it to the corner and without really making it the main theme. It's just a characteristic of our character. Right. But it's one of the things I really like about the story, that and the songs. I really like about the story. Did you want to say something? Because I'm ready to keep talking.
Well, that was just going to lead into, so I was going to ask if you'd like to talk about some of your inspirations for the story and the things that are in it. The songs especially.
Yeah, of course. So what I really wanted to do with Dissonance, as well as all the stuff we've just talked about, is I wanted the music to be really a core of it. And I wanted that to, because I really love folk music, and because I think there's something very magical about that sort of storytelling through music, I wanted to really bring it out through the book and make the songs actually magic, but not in a kind of wave a big magic wand wizardy kind of a way, but more of this kind of like subtle use of it, and it's very sort of linked to nature. So that was one thing I wanted to do. And then I thought, how am I going to connect this into sort of the folklore I wanted to use, which was kind of already very much fleshed out in my head, which was going to be birds, because I'm using Cornish folklore, and birds are very special in Cornish folklore, as they are often believed to sort of carry the souls of humans in them. So when sailors die, people in Cornwall believe that the souls of the sailors live in the seagulls that sort of fly over the coast. And also there's quite a lot of sort of Arthurian stuff about when King Arthur dies, he reincarnates as this Cornish chuff and things like that. And I thought, okay, well, I've got the birds, I've got the magic song thing. Well, obviously it's bird song, isn't it? Like that's being the link between the two of them. So yeah, it just sort of really fleshed out from there, really. And I wanted it to be very sort of primal and passionate, because I think what I wanted to do differently when in this one compared to Testament is very sort of, it's almost quite prim and proper in many ways. And actually I wanted to write something that's a lot rougher and more like visceral, and yeah, all of that just seemed to come together in a kind of perfect way, really. I've just seen Kat's in the chat been talking about the chronic illness stuff as well, which I hear you, Kat.
Yeah. So for those of you who got an early sneak peek, what was the big thing that struck you about the story? Was it the music? Was it I'm a big fan of the mist. What was it that really, kind of stuck out with you?
I think before answering that about the story, I just wanted to reinforce your point about the kind of language that Alexandra uses. So I consume a lot of my fiction as audiobooks because I spend, my day job is coding, my hobby is writing. I just don't want to look at screens or words that much anymore.
Right.
So having been sent the Word document, I basically got Microsoft Office to read it to me. And its voice is pretty bland, so it's like watching a film without the special effects. The fact that I can hear it and I've got this bland voice going into my head and it's still getting converted into this kind of beautiful lyricism, I think says a lot for Alexandra's writing.
I agree.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I think the main things for me were the clear nature elements, the symbiosis between the humans and the birds, and ultimately, because it's a story based on ancient myth. It's about how visceral life would have been back in that time. It's a really, I think it's really useful to remind ourselves from time to time of what it would have been like for prehistoric people living in a time when everything was about survival, and that simply wasn't guaranteed from one day to the next. But I absolutely love the link between the humans and the birds. I think it's a fascinating idea.
So for me, the thing that really drew me, I love Cornwall, and we'd been to Cornwall and to Tintagel not long before, and I'd stood there on those cliffs trying to imagine, if you've ever been there, they have those remains of houses on the edges of cliffs, and I'd stood there and tried to imagine that, and then I started reading this book and it was like I'd just been transported into that place. It was so completely absorbing straight away. If you're somebody that loves Cornwall and loves that history and that sense of that amazing coastline, I think this book is just a real treat. You'll fall in love with it just as much as I did, and then you just very much get drawn into this entire world, which is really remarkable because it's such a different world to the one we live in. So
Yeah, and for me, anyone who knows Alex knows she throws herself in 200% to anything and everything she does, and that just oozes from the page quite clearly. Her love for poetic, lyrical, musical language, her love for nature, for Cornish in particular folklore, all of the elements, the musicality of it, the folklore, anything and everything that's important to her is in this book. And you cannot doubt that when you read it, that it was written by an author who is deeply passionate about what she's writing about. And that, as you've all said, just makes it so much more compelling as a story to be read.
I promised myself I wasn't going to cry, but I'm failing at that now, friends.
It's okay. That's one thing that if you follow Alex on social media, especially on Twitter, the one thing that you will be very aware of very fast is the love of folklore. Yes. And it's so fascinating, especially, Twitter only allows you to get a mouthful of bits, to get a story across. So I think it, yes. I think that, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. But it's hard to write in a Twitterscape something about folklore that you would really find interesting. I mean, Twitter doesn't allow for a lot of characters or a lot of depth. And so I think it says a lot about a writer when you can take basically a whole entire idea that people have written thousands of pages about and put it on a tweet and be like, well, hold on now, I want to know more about that. So I think it really goes to, I know one of the things we always ask people to do is, okay, so you've written your book. We love your book. Now you have to tell us basically in a marketplace blurb, which is very small, about your book. And then you have to sum up your book in a summary that we can turn into the back matter and the description on websites. And it's the one thing that I think it may be our number one complaint from the writers is like, how do I turn this whole book into
one single phrase,
right,
one sentence,
right, one sentence or a blurb for the back. But Alex, I don't know if you struggle with it, but when I read your tweets, I was like, this is a skill. Taking this and putting it down into a short text is a huge skill. And so, listen, you guys, if you've ever liked her folklore tweets, you have to read this book. I recommend both of them, and I may be biased, but this book in particular is so, I mean, it's like you finally got the breath to speak it all, you know, so it's really delightful. And yes, Kat, to answer your question, I will try to put links in the YouTube description when this is over and after it publishes later this afternoon, because I have to go to the bookstore this afternoon. So when we get home from that, I'll tidy it up. So, but okay, so what else? Did you want to ask something? Oh, good, then I'll keep going. Okay.
Well, I mean, I was going to add a little bit to what you were saying, is that we both really enjoy your daily folklore posts. We love reading those every day. It's a good point of, especially with the jobs we do. It's like we need a breath from that, and it's like, oh yeah, let's read what Alex is up to today.
Right. Especially sometimes I'll be thumping something. I have I'm a rock collector, especially crystals. And so if you could see my desk, there's probably 40 on them. So sometimes when I get really fed up with work, I'll pick one up and thump it against the desk. And Steve will be like, did you see Alex's folklore post today? Go find it on Twitter.
That's really nice to hear.
Sometimes you just really need a break. So anyway, that's how Twitter should be used, is your 5-minute break from your day job.
That's very much why I'm posting folklore on Twitter, because it's my break.
It's a breath of fresh air. It's a breath of fresh air. So when did your love for folklore start?
Oh, that's a really good question. Can I define any one point? Probably not, but I remember being very young in Cornwall and my mum telling me stories about the knockers in the mines. Paul's just said in the chat that you should see at my desk. My desk is covered in like animals and birds and everything you would expect my desk is covered in. Like, it's those things. And every time I go to like a craft place where there's more carved wooden animals, like it gets progressively fuller. One day it will be a problem, but not yet. So I mean, like my mum would tell me these stories about the knockers and how that they are like these fae type creatures in the mines of Cornwall. And what I really loved about that is, as I thought about it more and more as I over the years, I realized that there's all of these chunks of folklore that are there to explain away things that people didn't quite understand or that they were scared of and they wanted to rationalize, or they wanted to create a story to, like when you tell your like when your children would have been told, or like don't go into the woods because the witch is there or whatever, and actually they're just trying to keep you safe, but they've wrapped this folklore around it to make it sort of relatable almost. That's what I think I fell in love with and realized is what I loved about the knockers story, because it was all about like these drips of water in the mines that were like dipping away, and people thought, well, it must be these like fae creatures or whatever, or these little like goblin things. And if you stray too far into the mines, like the knockers will get you. So don't go too far down the mine shaft on your own because you'll get taken, type thing. Which, if you think about it, it's a very useful safety message. Don't go down a mine shaft on your own. But actually it's wrapped up in all this folklore. And I just think there's so much of that, and it's really fascinating. And I think that's really what keeps me loving it.
Okay, so I'll give everybody else a minute to think about their favorite kind of folklore story growing up. Steve's will be weird and about swamps or voodoo, probably, but because he grew up in New Orleans. But I'll go first. Mine is short, so you only have a few seconds to think about it. But I grew up in Kansas. And, you know, the thing about Kansas here is it's wheat and corn and cattle. And there are stories, of course, we tell about cornfields, and it's mostly to teach our children that if the corn is taller than you, you don't go into a cornfield, because here in America, the corn is planted very closely together to maximize crop yield. And the leaves of our corn is not soft and silky, like apparently it is in a lot of Europe. It is like razor blades. And so once it starts to unfurl, it'll cut you on your arms as you walk through.
Yeah,
and
the
I don't
paper
remember,
cuts,
I don't remember the rhyme, but there's a rhyme about blood in the cornfields helps the corn grow larger. And it's kind of a horrible little bit, but there are all sorts of kind of folkloric stories about children being swallowed alive by the cornfields. And I suspect it's really based on historical events of children getting lost in the corn and unable to be found once we started big, massive farm productions here in the late 1800s.
Yeah, and they're on such a huge piece of land, so it's very easy. The corn's like over 6 foot, 7 foot tall. You get lost out there.
Yeah.
You might never find your way back out.
I mean, from east to west, it takes 9.5 hours to drive the state of Kansas. And once you get outside of an hour from where we live, it's agricultural. And so when people talk about agricultural farms, we're talking about farms that have thousands of acres of corn and wheat yield. And so when a kid walks into a cornfield when the corn is 6 feet tall, it is, I mean, if it's 1,000-acre yield, you will never find that kid again. I mean, it takes like bloodhounds, and I've heard stories of people using pigs to try to find children. I mean, it is. And because of that, I won't even do a corn maze that's been man-made for fun for Halloween. I won't have any part of it.
And Stephen King's Children of the Corn made it even worse for her.
Yeah, that was, I mean, it just kind of, it made me wonder if he had ever been to Kansas. Yes, people think corn mazes for fun. Yeah.
It's beginning to sound like Stephen King was your third parent.
A little bit. I mean, I don't know if it's because we're American or my mother raised us on the real fairy tales, but we didn't do so well. I mean, listen, I'll watch Disney Sleeping Beauty when I can't sleep, hands down all the time. But when you grow up on the real Grimm's and Perrault fairy tales, Stephen King is almost your next natural read when you hit 4th grade or 5th grade. So, all right, Steve, what about your folkloric story from childhood?
Wow, that's kind of a hard one. It's been so long ago now. Like she said, I grew up in New Orleans, and there's a lot of stories. Mostly, a lot of it revolves around voodoo and how to stay away from it if you're not part of that. And anybody that messed with voodoo, everybody else tended to be kind of afraid of them. So, I mean, that was one thing, but also,
I'm trying to think of the one you told me about the cemeteries when we first went down.
Well, okay, yeah. One of the big things, though, there was what we call the Honey Island swamp monster. And of course, you know, it was down around the Honey Island region, down in the swamps, but that was always, everybody knew somebody's cousin's brother's best friend who had actually seen the Honey Island swamp monster.
Right.
So that was our version of Bigfoot, I guess. Growing up. We also had this thing in New Orleans. I don't know if any of y'all have seen pictures, but all of the cemeteries, there's no bodies that are buried in the ground. They're in above ground crypts, and a lot of them are very ornate. There's a lot of statuary, and generally there's these real high wrought iron fences around the cemeteries, and they're actually very beautiful. It's an enjoyable walk to go through there and just look at the architecture of all the tombs and everything. But there were back in the 1800s, up until I want to say almost the Civil War time, bodies were buried in the ground.
Right.
Well, here's the thing about New Orleans in that area. You can dig, and I saw this in my own backyard. If you dig down 3 feet, it starts filling up with water.
Because it's below sea level, the whole
It was
town.
all
It's below
drained
sea
out
level.
marshland and swamp.
Right.
So it took a while, but gradually all the coffins, all the bodies that had been buried over time were rising up through the ground. And there was sometime in the late 1800s, all of a sudden all these coffins were coming back up out of the dirt, or bodies were emerging from them. And it scared a lot of people. And there was a lot of legends and stuff about that. But from that time on, it was strictly above ground crypts.
I really believe zombie folklore started in either Haiti or New Orleans because of the raising of the dead, because the coffins would the ground would kind of spit them out. Yeah.
But,
yeah,
we believe
that being terrifying to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Just you're walking to work one day and there's a coffin that's just risen out of the ground.
Well, we had this, there were stories about kids that had walked through the cemetery and gotten caught, either by, the dead, either a vampire or a ghoul or something or another. So we had it was a challenge among us to run through the cemetery at night.
Right.
And I never quite got the courage up to do it, because the idea was you would climb this wrought iron fence, jump over, run through the cemetery to the other side and climb out. And I was never quite brave enough to do it. So.
Our first time down in New Orleans, the tour guide told me the reason all of the graveyards are surrounded by tall wrought iron fences is everyone knows the dead can't pass through iron. And I was like,
okay.
I'm not going to make it here. I don't. Not going to make it. Okay, so everybody else, so talk about folklore stories from your childhood.
I mean, the things which I believed in as a child were probably not that interesting, because I was an extremely gullible child. So it involved the older children telling me that apple pie was made out of rat's guts. And I was like, but rats are red on the inside. Like, no, they're green. Like, they're not. Like, have you seen inside a rat? And I didn't eat apple pie for like 6 weeks after school.
This is excellent.
Where it turned out years later, I was talking to my mum about this, and those were the apples from our garden that had come off our trees that had gone to the school and got made into pie that I refused to eat because I thought it was rats.
That was probably quite a statement to the school admin.
Yeah. So I'm sorry that's not even slightly folklore.
Though it is a good story. It could be its own folklore. The green rat guts apples.
I can come back and tell you some Derbyshire folklore, but I'll let everyone else have a go from the childhood first.
Shall I have a go? Just because I was struggling to think of one, because my mum, being a fairly devout Baptist, really wasn't into sort of telling me folklore stories as a kid. But we went to Scotland on holiday, and of course, we had all the kind of like Loch Ness stuff, which is the typical thing. But this, Richard's just reminded me of the incident of the haggis, and them telling me the traditional folklore stroke trick that is played on tourists of the haggis being little furry creatures that run around the fields of Scotland. And that was when I was 6. And then when I was 12, there was something on the news about the haggis manufacturing industry. And I was utterly horrified. And my family were just sitting there going, "You believe that for 6 years? Like, why? I mean, French people eat frogs. Why would Scottish people not eat tiny little furry rodents running around their mouths?" So that's probably the closest. But I've always loved Scottish folklore. Maybe that's a little bit of the origin of it. The slightly more serious one was because I didn't have sort of local folklore. Instead, in my childhood, it was Greek myth that was the kind of inspiration to all sorts of wonderful adventures, because we were of the age where you could still run around the park and have a lot of freedom and so on as a young child. And those were the kind of myths and legends that I had access to and inspired a lot of imagination and adventure.
Yeah.
Well, when I was growing up, we one of the places we lived, because my dad was in the army, so we moved around quite a lot. But one of the places we lived, there was quite a lot of nature trails and paths around the back of the army base we were on. And so we used to go for walks with my mum, and this was when I was probably about 8 or so. And I just remember one time when we came across a little clearing in the woods in the middle of, lots of lovely trees and lots of birds singing, all the rest of it. And there was just this very clear little round circle, maybe about 6 inches in diameter, of much greener grass around all the other slightly less green grass, with a few daisies around, whatever. And my mum told me that that was obviously a fairy circle. And obviously being about 8 and extremely gullible, I got completely hoodwinked by this and didn't just think it was just a bit of greener grass. And so I've always had this thing of folklore being intimately connected to nature, because that was my first experience of it. And it's also, I suppose, that was sort of interesting because at that point it was very much a sort of the twee 19th century Victorian fairies. They're lovely, they're sweet, and they're nice. They're little, just tiny people. It was only somewhat later that I came across the sort of more original version of fairies, that they're not quite so small, they're definitely not so nice, and if you give them half a chance, they'll rip your head off. So it's sort of interesting getting older and finding out that, particularly as you said earlier, the thing about the grim fairy tales versus the sanitized versions, finding out that there's something behind it, but the something that's behind it is rather less Disney.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Very, very. What about you, Paul? Do you have a folklore story from childhood?
It's not specifically from childhood per se, but I think I can talk about a couple of things that possibly tell you more about me than Alex and I would like to know, but I think you'll enjoy it. So anyone who knows me knows that I quite like dragons, but as dragons are real and not folklore, I'm not going to talk about dragons.
Excellent.
But one thing that really I think stays with me is actually I'm going to mention a sort of medley of creatures that for me fall into a similar pot and share a lot of characteristics, and it's something that I think has always been a part of my psyche is mermaids, selkies, and other sort of folklore of the sea. And I think there's various reasons for why these crop up in quite such a young age, as things like Disney's The Little Mermaid, right through to some quite horrifying depictions. And it's that idea of this utterly beautiful creature at one end, but this utterly terrifying thing at the other end. And I think just how they link into so many primeval sort of emotions and fears and attractions within people, such as the idea of that haunting, beautiful melody and knowing where it's going, and you can just imagine sailors lost in a fog or on the coast, just hearing the music of it. Nature is so musical, and just hearing the song of the coast, the song of the sea, whatever it is, and trying to put a face and a name to it and being captivated. You can just see how easy people can fall into those traps. So for those that aren't aware, selkies are a Celtic creature who are quite often depicted as seals, but they can shed their skin and become human. But of course, there's always that, which is why this makes such a beautiful bit of folklore, is when they shed their skin, that skin is there, it's available, it can be stolen. And of course, that opens you up to a world of wonderful, romantic, not so romantic, dangerous, not so dangerous stories of what happens, who gets hold of the skin, what it's used for, where it goes from there. And there's just such a rich tapestry there, I think. And you'll find that mermaids, selkies, and a lot of creatures like that share a lot of these tropes with the haunting voice of the siren and all those other sort of things that come in.
It's really interesting to me because there's a whole different folklore. I lived in Maine briefly, up on the East Coast of the US, and there's a very different folklore that's more involved with the sea and with water. And because, so much of where a lot of people live in Maine is on the coast versus further inland because of the winter. And so, we're here in the Midwest, it's all tied to storms and agriculture. And it's just so different. But the sea folklore and legend of New England is big. I mean, you could fill store after store of sea stories. And I was surprised they have a story of a fisherman's wife who, they don't call it a silky, but I was like, do they know? Do they know that the story is an old silky story? and it's about someone stealing her bathing cloak, so she can't return. It's reversed almost. She can't return to her husband because someone has stolen her bathing cloak. And so she can't, that's like her skin to put on to be human.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, do they know? Do they know this came from the United Kingdom? Do they know? Do they know that this is an older story than this? But there's something very enchanting, I think, about the sea and us. I mean, humanity.
It's interesting how popular it's become as well, isn't it? Like one of the things I did at WorldCon was sit on a panel about songs that were about Selkies and Scottish folklore and that sort of thing. And quite a few of this, there was like a whole chunk where we were talking basically about different sort of Selkie adjacent lore, and where, like you say, Heather, where it's just sort of in there and you kind of think, oh, that actually a Selkie thing? Like it reminds me of one of the stories they were telling about I think it was a man and his wife that were walking by a river, and she did something like lift her apron, or the wind blew her apron in front of her face, and she looked like a swan. So her husband shot her, and then she died, which is obviously very, very tragic. But they were talking about, well, is that actually like a shapeshifter story by a sort of another name? Because when the cloak moves, is that actually her like swan skin in a sort of very Selkie way?
Right.
It's actually like infused in quite a lot, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. This is a very dark turn, but I was at a conference about the Violence Against Women Act here in the US, and somebody told a shape-shifting story where a woman, her cloak blew around her and her husband thought that she was essentially turning into a werewolf and shot her. And that was the story they opened the conference with. Like, are they shape-shifting folklore, or are they murder stories? And I'm like, hold on. Did we talk to a folklorist before we wrote this introduction? Like, I don't know that I've ever heard that this is really a story on wife murder. Like, but it's interesting how in our society, we adapt it to the lens that we see it through. Like this conference was all about violence. It was about partner violence on both sides. But I was like, it's interesting to me that we've essentially taken a shape-shifting story and turned it into a domestic violence story, because that's the lens we're currently, that was the focus of the conference. And I thought, humanity is very interesting because it makes me think, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, what did the Selkie story really look like? What did the story of souls flying away from the body, or whatever language was used for that, like what did that look like 3,000 years ago compared to today? Because every generation puts their own spin on it. And it's so fascinating to me. I'm a big lover of find the earliest written version we can, and then learn everything you can about the translator. Like Beowulf being written down by monks, so they tried to Christianize as much of the story as they could to make it palatable to themselves and a Christian audience. And I was like, so when you read it, I'm like, how heavily did we edit this? Like, what was the original story here? And so I'm a huge fan of, find the biggest one and then get to know the translator, or who we think translated it, or the monastery that translated it. Because there's so many old stories that were translated by monks And sometimes when you read the translations, I'm like, I'm not sure the monk knew the original language. I think somebody told the story and he wrote it down his own way. I'm not real sure this translation is very good. But it's fascinating to me. And it's one of the things Steve's really interested in because he loves linguistics. And so he loves the play on words, especially over time, how different words take on.
Well, and how the meanings of words change.
Yeah. And I like to pick up words because I have ADHD and I'm dyslexic. So when I can't think of the word I'm trying to put my finger on, I'll completely make up the word. And then Steve has to, I call him my interpreter. He's like, okay, let's figure out what this word really is. Do you remember the word the other day that you couldn't, I came up with a word and Steve's like, I have no idea what you're trying to say, but this word that you have written is not a real word, even remotely. And so I think it's great that I'm in publishing, but yeah, Steve's the editor of our group, but because I'd buy anything, you could make up words and I'd be like, of course that's a word. Clearly it means this. Use it in the context.
Yeah, that same thing happens to me, and my early readers are like, "This is not a word." Like, it is a word. Look, you know what it means. Like, it's not a word. You've just made this up, but I'm not aware that I've made it up. I've just put it in.
Right. Listen, I think all great fantasy writers make up words.
Yeah, it's just creativity, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at Heinlein's Grok from Stranger in a Strange Land. I use Grok all the time.
Yeah.
And I read that book, like, I don't know, 30 years ago. And people
Grok
who are my
real word, isn't it? I mean, it means, in Northern England, it means to look at something. I'll take a Grok at it. I'll have a look at it. It's a real word.
Well, it is now.
It is now, but we can thank Robert Heinlein for it because before him, it was in fact not.
Really? No. I think we just came over here and all they nicked it.
Oh, Kat, you're right. Shakespeare, I think, was the biggest word maker upper. You know, so, and we all fell for it.
You don't have the right word to rhyme with the previous sentence.
Make it up.
You know, one thing I've
words
always
have to start somewhere.
That's right. They have to start somewhere. We all made up the words. That's what I like to tell Steve. Once upon a time, all these words were made up. You can't get after me for making up words. Humans have been doing it since we learned to speak.
Well,
I wanted to come back to your point about folklore and mythology kind of changing with time. And there's definitely what you're saying about kind of going back to the earliest version and saying, what did people do to this? How did that change? But I think, in fact, the way that it changes over time is really interesting and really important too. Yeah. So it can be re-expressed for the needs of that age. So like the Arthurian cycle starts off with some bards writing about the people who are essentially having an uprising against the invading Saxons. You know, we've got a Celtic warlord who's holding the line for a generation and disappears. But then later he becomes this quintessential English hero, or he's retold in French courts. And each time it's being remade for people in that time. And I think as a result of having intellectual property and copyright and things, we've kind of lost something, as in the mythic heroes of the last 50 to 100 years are all owned by someone. So we can't go and take Batman and go, oh, let's do our own thing with Batman. It expresses something we need. Go on, Sally.
Fiction exists. But fan fiction exists, and it's like there's a huge, and for the first time in history, people are actually able to really share those stories. You can tell I do fan fiction occasionally, but you know, like people sharing these stories and these reinterpretations, and actually, you know, more minority groups that aren't well represented in mainstream media often take those stories and reinterpret them for themselves, which is an amazing thing. And you know, you can read some terrible fan fiction, but there's also some really good fan fiction, and quite a lot of authors start off their practice is, you know, playing with these characters they love. Humans have been doing it forever, though. I mean, I'm a big Jane Austen fan, and the Jane Austen fan fiction is a massive thing that's been going on for like 200 years, and you know, is a published genre in its own right. You know, for example. Sorry.
I was going to say,
go on,
I just wanted to
mention on the myths changing, going back to Greek mythology, you can actually see it in the stories where you have the first layer of like gods and goddesses. It's a female goddess, and then you can see how at some point, as they wanted the male god to be, the male gods come and literally replace the female god, the female deity in their myths. It's absolutely astounding. It's right there in front of us, the way that they reappropriated the old stories for the world that they were creating at that point, which is amazing.
I think it's fascinating. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I love to read the cycles of folklore and myth retelling and legends, how they change over time, because I think it reveals a lot about the time where the people wrote them down that way. It tells us more about them than it does the original story, because they take the pieces that are important to them and they change the pieces that they need to change to fit their, it's almost like propaganda. They change, they swerve the story. I will never forget the day I was in college. A professor told me there are Medusa stories that don't involve rape. And I was like, hold on. That is contrary to everything I read growing up. How can that possibly be true? And they really attribute it to a lot of Roman influence. And I'm like, hang on. So I think that's probably, I've always loved history, but I think where I switched from like being a history teacher to a historian was probably that professor. When I was like, oh, hang on, I don't want to learn how to teach this to other people. I want to just study this. Like, that's what I want to do instead. And so I think it's a fascinating, like weaving of our own history and our own folklore in America is very young, because we killed off the people who lived here first almost completely. And so there's like in the last 15 years, there's kind of been a resurgence of Indigenous people stories and Indigenous people history and folklore. So it's getting richer, but we kind of had a pretty, when people are like, I wish Americans wouldn't write, German history or German folklore. I'm like, well, listen,
we don't really have strong roots here.
When you're a colonizer, you got to go back to where your people came from, because it's really kind of awful to talk about the place you've colonized. There's really no way to celebrate that. So it does. We do kind of borrow a lot from the people who came over 100 or 300 years ago. So but it's made a strange mix. Like New Orleans to me is the biggest, because you get old folklore and legends that start from like when it started as a small port town to like just the recent influx of Brazilian immigrants. And before then it was Italian, and before that it was Irish. And so there's a hodgepodge.
It's a strong mix of Creole, Caribbean, African, Native American, and the French and Spanish settlers. So I mean, it's a weird place to hang out and listen to folklore stories because of that. I think the rest of New Orleans is a little sketchy. But if you can get on a folklore tour or even a ghost story tour, those are very fun. But one thing that I've enjoyed about folklore around the world, across the board, is just how much the specific land and the geology affects the way people look at things and the stories. And we've touched on that some here, but like people that live by the ocean or on the coast, their stories are quite a bit different from the ones who live in the interior or the ones who live in and out of the swamp. It's just a totally different mood and outlook. And I love that. So.
And I think that comes across, just to bring it back to the book, I think that comes across in the book. Like if you are interested in sea folklore or where land meets water folklore, that plays heavily. Thanks for coming, Kat. But it plays heavily in the story, almost like its own character in the story. Like the mist is almost like its own character in the story, and the water is almost its own character in the story. And so I love that about folklore, but I love that especially about this story.
I think that's quite a sort of powerful characteristic of sort of folklore and folk horror as well, actually, is like the land as an entity. Because I think one of the things we haven't actually touched on here is that while I call it sort of folklore fantasy, there's actually quite a lot of folk horror in Dissonance of Birdsong. And I think I feel like I might sort of be going through my folk horror era, because I might write more. And I am going to write more, but I feel like it's going to get more and more folk horror, which I really love. But yeah, I mean, there's something about that where the land is kind of can be your ally, but it can be your adversity. Adversary. And so I think that's just something that's really interesting, isn't it? And that really, for me, was a sort of key part that I wanted to bring across in Dissonance, is like that kind of warring sort of internal conflict about whether you trust the sea and what's in the sea, or whether you try and get rid of it in some way. And that's quite a sort of dichotomy, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's fabulously done in this work. It really is. So, I mean, I think that all good folklore has an element of folk horror. And again, I could just be speaking from I'm right.
There's good, happy folklore too.
I don't read that kind. I'm sure it exists, but I do feel like there is kind of a tendency to, because your weather, your land. Here in the Midwest, if you don't get enough rain, you don't eat next year, and we have a surplus of food now, so it's not as big of a danger. But I very carefully watch the weather and the farm yields to decide what foods to stock up in the pantry and the freezer, so I don't have to pay exorbitant prices next year. And so it is very, like when the crops failed in Iowa a couple years ago before the pandemic because of all the flooding, I was like, oh gosh, we've got to buy as much pork as we can, because it was the corn feeder crop that mostly died, which is what we feed our animals. So I was like, oh Steve, we have to find somebody and get a whole hog. Like, this is going to be awful. But I think that's it, is that if you grow up on a coast, you're tied to the fishing industry in some way. If you grow up in an agricultural or what's the word I'm looking for? Animal farm. You're tied to the seasons and pestilence that whips through animals, because we all still have to eat, and the weather still matters. So I don't know how it is in the UK now, but the last time I was there, I didn't stay in a single place that had air conditioning. And I saw some of the weather you guys have had the last 2 summers, and I'm like, oh no, I would not be able to sleep at all. I mean, like, I would have to just go outside and rough it. There's no way you'd catch me in a building in that kind of stagnant air. But
yeah, we're definitely not set up for that. And I mean, I don't know what others think as well, but I think there's quite a disconnect now between people and the land here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm finding it quite interesting that you knew enough about what the crops were doing and what the animals were, what animals that was going to affect, that you knew what you needed to stock up on. Like, I think if that happened here, no one would know. Like, we would just be kind of hoping that there was still going to be chicken nuggets in the supermarket and being a bit like, what do you mean there isn't any? What? I don't get it. So, yeah, I mean,
that's a Midwestern trait. If you went outside of the agricultural center of the U.S., people aren't as in tune to the weather and the crops and the animals as you are here. We live and breathe it here. It's like I joke on Twitter all the time. As a Kansas, I am compelled to talk about the weather, and I am compelled to talk about the wheat and corn yield constantly. Like, and cattle. These are the things that matter the most. It doesn't matter that I'm in the city now. Yeah.
I mean, we'll talk about weather all the time too, but for different reasons. So you have weather that lasts for months or even years, and that's the problem too. We'll typically have 4 seasons in 1 week, and that's why we're talking about it. So summer
One
today,
day
or it's gonna
sometimes.
be
Some
winter.
days.
Yes.
That just means a tornado is coming here. If we have 4 kinds of weather in one day, that's when we go underground.
We will complain when it's raining that it's not sunny, and we'll complain when it's sunny that it's not raining.
Yeah.
It's quintessentially a British trait.
Yeah.
Going back to the thing about having mythologies or folklore that is connected to the coast, is in Derbyshire, which is, for those of you who don't know your English geography, is a landlocked county, has 2 mermaid pools in it.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Wow.
There's one beneath Kinder Scout, and there's one called Blackmere just south of Buxton. So I don't know.
Wow.
I'll put some thoughts into why at some point. In fact, they're both going to appear in the story that I'm writing next.
Right.
I think.
Are they quite large, or?
They're both fairly small pools.
Right.
I've been out to one of them. I'm going to go to the other one fairly soon. One of them you have to you have to park the car like 2 miles away and like trek up the side of the hill, all the rest of it. And the other one you can just stop on the side of the road and hop out. And
that's fascinating, because pre-industrial, pre-cars, how on earth are the mermaids supposed to got there?
Yeah.
Well, the mermaids. So supposedly there's an underground channel that links the northern of the two to the sea,
right?
Because the water tastes salty. Allegedly, I meant to take a container and bring some back and maybe boil it before I tried drinking it, but I forgot, so I don't know. And given that it takes 2 hours to reach it, it's going to be a while before I try it again. But the other one, it's quite a grim story. So there's a woman from, I think, Buxton in the Middle Ages, who used to go and bathe in this pool that was then called the Blakemere. And there was a local man who took a shine to her and proposed to her, and she turned him down, at which point he killed her. No, sorry, he didn't kill her. He accused her of being a witch and persuaded other people to kill her, which is even worse.
Yeah.
And then, so for 3 days, he's feeling quite happy with himself because he's got one over on this poor dead woman. And then he gets dragged into this pool and ripped to pieces, and his body's just left floating on the surface of the pool, which is now inhabited by a mermaid, which is essentially the vengeful spirit of this woman who got burned as a witch.
Wow.
Then,
Excellent.
So it works. That thing about, don't go into the woods, you might get eaten by the witch because you don't want the children to wander off. Well, the children aren't going to mess with the pool now because it's full of dead body parts.
Yeah.
But it's also possibly a warning not to accuse women of being witches at random.
I think there's a good vengeance ballad in that. That must exist.
There is.
Yeah. So, Nick, I would agree with you. Midwesterners perhaps don't have a healthy enough respect for horse. I'm terrified of them. When we lived in Maine, we had to live on the coast because I didn't realize it coming from Kansas. Because, I mean, our yard is full of trees, but I can see the sky. And any place I go, I can see sky. But in Maine, that is not true. In Maine, if you get too far inland, all you see is the tree canopy until winter, and then you can see the sky.
That sounds amazing.
Very well.
And I didn't realize I was claustrophobic in that way until being in Maine. And if we got too far off the coast and outside of the farmland, I was like, I can't breathe here. Like, there's no sky here anywhere. I can't live here. So, Maine is a lovely place to visit. And it's beautiful in the fall for sure, but there are trees everywhere.
But I think the reverse is true. People that have grown up near woodland of one sort or another, they come out here where it's just wide open land and wide open. There's no place to hide. There's no cover. It's like, I feel
the flatter the land is, the bigger the sky feels.
Yeah. He's like, there's nothing but sky here. And I'm like, I know. Isn't it a relief? Isn't it easier to breathe? There's nothing between you and the air. It's fine.
Yeah, you're describing Norfolk in Britain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Feels like come full circle to the air conversation at the beginning, really.
Yes, and when we circled back around to being able to breathe. So, well, guys, it's time to wrap up, but it has been a lovely conversation as always. I'm so glad you guys were able to join us. Let's just do a quick, Kat's going to miss it, but a quick plug yourself if you've got anything to plug. Before what?
And also, Alex, if there's anything you'd like to say to your readers, as a final thought, please do so.
We'll let you go last, Alex. Oh, and we'll start with you. Plug away.
Sorry, who are we starting with?
Let's start with you.
Yeah. Right, I'm talking. So, hi, I'm Owen Oakwood. As I said at the beginning, I write cozy paranormal mysteries. And thanks for inviting me on this. And I'm very excited. I hope Alex's book does very well. It certainly deserves to.
Agreed. Patrick, you next.
Yeah, hi, Patrick Mann. So I'm a writer, also a book reviewer. I knew Alex professionally, worked together a few years ago. Again, same thing. If this is really enjoyed reading the book. Just about to write my review, and hope it does really well, Alex.
Thank you.
Sally, we'll do you next.
I'm Sally Price. I was lucky enough to beta read first drafts of both of Alex's novels, and really pleased to see this one out in the public. I am a hobbyist writer, and actually this conversation has been really useful for the latest idea I've had, and kind of like, I should get on and do something with that, because some of the ideas you've thrown around are actually really useful for it. So thank you.
Excellent. Paul.
Hi, thanks again for having us. I am Paul Martin. I'm a freelance editor, and I work on fiction as well as other genres and forms of publishing. I'm a history specialist. Anything history related, I love working on. And it was my absolute pleasure to do a little free read and slight edit of both of Alex's books. And very excited to see them in print.
Excellent. Alex, how about you? How do you want to wrap up today?
I'm going to do two things. I'm going to say Owen and I are going to what's called the Innsmouth Literary Festival on the 28th of September. We are going to have a stall together and have lots of lovely books. And that's one thing. And I'm going to do a bit of a giveaway as well of a signed copy of Dissonance, a Birdsong. So have a look on my Instagram, which is where I'm going to run it. I'm going to do a very old-fashioned names out of the hat, but I'll put some details on there in the next few days about what that's going to look like. And finally, I was just going to wrap up by saying something a little bit mushy, which is having done WorldCon and then launched straight into book launch week for Dissonance of Birdsong, I feel like a real author now. And I know that's a really silly thing to say because I was published before, but this time around it's felt a lot more special. And so I just because of all the wonderful reviews that have been coming in. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's beta read, everyone who's reviewed it, everyone who's encouraged me along the way, particularly to Paul, who puts up with a lot of me just talking about books all the frickin' time. So just a big thank you to everyone who's made this possible.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us and for everybody who joined it. And it'll post live on Facebook and YouTube for anybody who missed the original. And we'll share links for that once it goes up this afternoon. And we'll add some links to it. But Dissonance of Birdsong is out in the world, so you can order it from any bookstore. You might be able to grab some on the shelves soon. I've heard a rumor about a Waterstones order coming through. I just don't know which one, right? So it's hard to say where it's going to end up.
I need to ask you about this.
Yeah, but a Waterstones has ordered 4 copies to go to one of the stores somewhere. So that was exciting to see this weekend.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know which one, but it's headed to a store. So
that is awesome. Well done.
Excellent.
Okay, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry.
It's always a win. It's always a win. So you guys have a fabulous day. And everybody else who catches us, just keep reading. Always read, always read, always read.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'll talk to you guys later.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Cheers. Lovely to see you all.
Great to meet you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.